Hi, I'm Lindsey. Lindsey Powell. I'm a postdoc in Rebecca Sachs's lab at MIT. Although most of the work that I'm going to talk about today is work I did while a graduate student at Harvard with Liz Kelsey, doing mostly behavioral research with infants. So today I'm going to talk about the developmental side of what can introduce the topic of sort of the behavioral study of social perception. So just to recap, because I know we're also connecting to these central themes, what I've been communicated to the thrust or goal is that we want to understand the content of the systems that support social perception. So people go around interacting with one another very intelligently all the time, but what's the material on which they're basing those interactions, and how is that material structured and used to support social interaction? So some of the things that we're trying to figure out how to answer are who is there, what are they doing, who is doing what to whom, and what does one person think of another person. So I'm actually, I think you guys got a lot on the developmental side of those first two questions from Laura Schultz while she was here. She talked a lot about infants' perception of agents and basic actions they might be engaged in on their own. So throughout the talk today, when I pull on examples from the developmental literature, I'm mostly going to try to talk about social interactions and relationships between people, or who is there in the sense of who's there in terms of their relationship to other people out there as well. Oh, right, and also what will happen next. So clearly a lot of adults' ability to answer those questions and to act on the answers to those questions comes from social experience. So you need to know how telephones work to understand what a person is doing when they're talking into this inanimate object. It's not going to be immediately clear to an infant what kind of social interaction is going on there. But there are also a lot of building blocks in place in infancy, and we can study especially if the goal is to understand nonverbal social cognition. They're an ideal population to sort of understand what are the early building blocks of nonverbal social cognition in terms of understanding who people are and what their actions mean and what they're going to do, because really that's all they can do anyway, right? So, but it's not as simple as you might think. So you could say, okay, we've seen some really simple examples of tasks that adults do. So Ken told you, for example, about Nalini Ambedi's research, where you show people still faces and have them make snap judgments of that person's sexual orientation. So maybe babies can tell all kinds of things from faces, but you can't put a face up there and ask them to respond in the dimension of, do you think this person is gay or straight, right? So while they're really good at perceiving nonverbal social stimuli, they're uncoordinated research participants that you can't instruct or extensively train the way that you could train potentially non-human animal participants. So the challenge is to figure out what kinds of nonverbal social perception they're doing with the kinds of things that you can have them do in an experimental setting. And so a lot of what I'm going to do today is talk about the kinds of methods that people apply to understanding social perception in infancy, and then I'll give you examples of the content that's come out of those sorts of methods to illustrate each one. So most of the methods that people use with infants under a year are looking time methods, right? So, Ken put up gorgeous videos of animals engaging in social interaction, and you could potentially tell a lot by watching how those animals behave. When it comes to 4-month-olds, you're not going to be able to tell that much by watching how they behave because they don't really do a lot yet. Not only can you not give them instructions, even if you could, they couldn't necessarily carry out those actions. All they really do is sit there and look at the world. And so researchers have capitalized on that tendency for them to just sit and observe by looking for patterns in the way that they choose to observe the world. So there's a few different ways that people use looking time methods. One is preferential looking, to just put two things side by side and see which of the two do babies choose to look at. And there's sort of two things you're actually trying to assess here. One is whether they find one of those things more interesting or more pleasing or affectively valued than the other, drawing their attention to it. But implicitly, there's also something in there which is a question of whether or not they can distinguish those two things at all. Right, and so in different cases, you might be testing one of those questions more than the other. So, for example, if you show a baby two shapes that are very different in terms of their contour and color, it's highly likely that they can distinguish the two. They might not have a preference for one versus another, so you won't get any difference in where they choose to look. Alternatively, you could imagine it's hard to think of the right example for a baby, but for an adult, you could put two diamonds in front of them and know for sure that or a diamond and a fake in front of them, and know for sure that they prefer to have the higher value diamond. But maybe the problem there is just that they can't tell the two apart, right? So preferential looking tests are alternatively testing either what's more interesting or whether or not the two things are discriminable for a baby. A method that came up a little bit, I think, in Laura's lecture, although maybe not quite in the context that I'll talk about it today, is habituation. So basically what things are similar to one another in the world. When you show infants repeated stimuli or even changing stimuli, you can see the extent to which they consider those things to be the same by how quickly their interest declines. And then you can also see, once their interest has declined, if you show them something new, whether it rebounds, it's suggesting that they see that new thing as being dissimilar from what they've been watching up to that point. This relates a little bit to the kind of violation of expectation looking that Laura did talk about sometimes. So for example, I think she talked about a paradigm where there's an actor reaching for an object over and over again, and I'll go over this again in just a minute. But the idea is that once you've seen an actor reach for one of two objects, if you switch the location of the objects, you can ask what infants expect that actor to do by measuring their look to both of the two kinds of reaches that you show them next, and see if they look longer at one than the other, the idea being whichever one they look longer at is something they find unexpected given the introduction. Other times, the things that are surprising by default. So she talked about an experiment with objects where there's a rotating screen going back and forth, and babies see that for a while, but really, this is just an introduction to what's going on in the scene. What comes next is you put a box behind one half of the rotation of the object, babies over here, and you see whether they expect the screen to stop when it hits the box or to keep going flat to the ground. You could imagine doing that experiment without doing any kind of introduction at all, right? It might just be the case that from the get-go, they have an expectation about what that screen should do when it hits the box, and based on that sort of baseline theory about the world, they're going to be surprised when something happens that doesn't match it, and that's going to cause them to look longer at that scene. So violation of expectation can either just be what's surprising by default given your priors about the world, or what's surprising given what you've just seen an actor or a person doing in a given situation. A final looking time method that people use is anticipatory looking, and you can see how, for intelligence, this is actually particularly one you might be interested in whether or not infants are capable of, because what's really helpful in the world is to know what someone's going to do next so that you can anticipate it and interact with them in a way that's going to sort of coalesce well with their actions, so that you can coordinate behavior with other people. You can't coordinate in retrospect. You have to coordinate by thinking about what people are going to do in advance. Finally, infants do have some motor skills. They get better, especially as they get older. So there are a bunch of infant studies, especially looking at social cognition, given that it's an area of cognition that's all about interacting with other people and not just observing them. So there are some infant studies that use active preference measures, things like reaching for or crawling for one individual over another, choosing a toy offered by one person versus another, choosing who to help if you have to make a choice between who you'd like to help. And these measures are taken as a sign of who infants like or trust. So that's sort of the range of methods that I'm going to talk about today. And as I go through each one, I'm going to give examples of research on social perception that has used each of those methods. And I've tried to sort of keep themes throughout the different methods so that I'm talking a little bit about the same kinds of social perception as has been studied by different methods, but it's also going to hop around a little bit. So feel free to stop me at any point if you have questions about anything. And here we go. All right, so preferential looking. As I mentioned, this is just putting two things side by side and seeing which one babies look at more. It's a relatively ambiguous measure in terms of what's driving the preference for one thing over another, but I can tell you whether or not infants can distinguish two things and what they find most interesting in the world. And so when it comes to social perception, one of the earliest challenges is identifying people or agents out there in the world that you should be paying attention to so that you can learn about them and interact with them socially. And people have long observed that newborn infants tend to orient toward faces, but people decided to use preferential looking as a way to figure out just exactly how are these brand new babies who haven't really seen people or agents in their faces very much at that point, how are they recognizing those faces and picking them out in the world? So what perceptual schema might there be that from 2 minutes after 10, probably more like 10 or 12 or 20 or 30 minutes after they're born, given how cooperative their parents are, what kinds of perceptual schemas do you have that are helping you pick out faces in the world that you can pay attention to? And so the general observation that people had started with is that if you make a schema of a face where there are sort of more that are sort of top-heavy, there are more dark spots or points of interest in the top half of the face than in the bottom half of the face, babies will look longer at the one that's top-heavy over the one that's bottom-heavy, which roughly corresponds to a right-side-up face where you have two eyes over a mouth, as opposed to an upside-down face where you'd have the reverse. So researchers said, okay, fine, is that all it is? Is it just about top-heavy images that have more stuff at the top than they do at the bottom? So what they did is they reversed the contrast of the images in a bunch of interesting ways to see how specific is the schema of a face that babies are drawn to. So they did this whole series of experiments. Like I said, the first thing they did was just reverse the contrast. So there they changed the white face with the black eyes and mouth to a black face with white eyes and a white mouth, and found that infants no longer showed a preference to look at the right side up face essentially versus the upside down face. And then they wanted to know, okay, well, how much of it? So the idea is you need several, at least two dark spots at the top half of the image on a white background. But how large does that white background have to be? Are they basically looking for eyes? And so they kept the black overall sphere, but they added in, you can see in experiment 1C, they added sort of pupils to the white eyes, and now they recover the preference that they had before for babies to look at the right side up face versus the upside down face. And so they did similarly. They took real faces and they just reversed the polarity of the contrast from a normally presented face to a reverse contrast face, and found that indeed what infants are essentially looking for are eyes, sort of dark pupils on white backgrounds. And you can see this across a variety of versions of these face stimuli. That newborn infants tend to orient toward faces as defined by eyes in the top half of the image over upside down faces that have the same visual features in general presented in reverse. So this is an example of how researchers use preferential looking to figure out what social information in the world infants can pick out immediately. But it's also something that can tell you what they learn through experience. We can't build everything in, right? So one of the things about being born into very variable social environments is that you're going to have to learn a lot about the particular people in your environment, the language in your environment, all those kinds of things after birth and through experience. And so babies do start to see a lot of faces as soon as they're born, and researchers wanted to know, are they extracting anything about what a typical face in their environment is by looking at all those faces of people that they see. And so they wanted to see, does experience looking at faces all the time alter face preferences? And in addition here, yep.
So is it possible to track the eye movements in these experiments? You're drawing the conclusion that babies are looking for eyes, but if you actually track their eye movements, did they actually converge after the eyes?
So in those particular experiments, the researchers didn't use eye trackers. There are eye trackers. They probably don't work particularly well with newborns who you have to orient a person with relationship to the eye tracking system relatively well. But certainly with older children, people do often look at how face perception works in terms of where in the face does the participant focus. Do they focus on the eyes versus the mouth? Do they scan the face the way that an adult does or not? Those particular studies were all just looking at one versus looking at the other and not tracking where in the face they were looking. But I think the idea is that given the relationship of the contrast pattern that they prefer to actual human faces and eyes, the idea is that that's the best explanation for why that would be the pattern that they would prefer. That they would prefer dark spots on a white background. Yeah. So it would be interesting to try to track and see if they focus in on the eyes, but that particular study. Yeah.
Can you go back to the graph? Yeah. Is the y-axis in seconds?
Yes, that's an S there.
So is that infant looking for 90 seconds?
So typically what they'll do is have some set window of time. So I don't know exactly what the total maximum amount of time they presented the faces for was for these infants. And then they'll say, out of that amount of time, how long did they look at one, how long did they look at the other, and how long did they look away? So it's not a 90-second look in constant duration. It's just given some window of time to look at those two things. how long do they choose to look at one versus the other within that window of time. All right, so does experience alter the kinds of face preferences that babies have early on? So people have contrasted, for example, how long infants look to genders of face. And so here, I was going to point out that there's actually two questions that you really want to ask here, given that these infants are so young. One of them is, do they have a preference for one face over the other? The other is, can they even tell those two faces apart? Given what we know about infant face perception, you might not be entirely sure that those two faces are going to be discriminable to a baby. But what it turns out is not only do infants have gender preferences, they actually are experience-based. So infants tend to look longer at the face that matches the face of their primary caregiver. So if they spend all day long looking at a female face, they prefer to look at the novel female face. If they're taken care of by a man, spend all day looking at a male face, they tend to look longer at the novel male face. Basically, it seems like they're drawn to whatever face matches the sort of average of their face perception to some extent. This is supported by the fact that you can find preferential looking to own race faces over other race faces, but that this actually only takes place in infants who are raised in racially homogenous environments. So it's not based on, say, who looks like mom or who looks like dad in particular, and sort of identifying social affiliative groups. If you have Ethiopian babies raised in Ethiopia versus in Israel, you find that the babies in the racially homogenous environment tend to prefer own race faces, but the babies in the heterogeneous environment actually don't have a preference for the race of their family over another race that they see frequently out in the world. So again, the kind of faces that you're seeing on a daily basis by the time you're 4 months sort of tend to make you gravitate toward one of those faces over another. Ken mentioned that attractive faces are basically average faces, the sort of the center of what you see. And it turns out that babies have a preference for attractive faces by 6 months of age as well. So you put an attractive person next to an unattractive person. I love that these papers never, ever give examples of their stimuli to protect the identities, I assume, of the unattractive faces that they use. But yeah, babies will prefer to look at the attractive person over the unattractive person by 6 months, suggesting that they're at least picking up on the variability in the faces that they see in the environment and forming some kind of perceptual schema of a real face, as opposed to, say, that schematic little face with the dots that they're using to guide where they look in the world.
I want to add here that I kind of tried to track those faces down. I finally found something for the attractive, unattractive. Unattractive faces are really unattractive.
Really?
So, I mean, you take it with a grain of salt. I mean, they were kind of
like almost malformed.
They were really weird looking. I forgot how I found it. It took a long time.
Gotcha.
A little bit of caveat here.
They might not even pass the test, the Ferroni test at the beginning of having the eyes of Me too. All right. So it turns out that visual, I mean, we're mostly talking about social perception and vision today, but I just want to point out that it turns out that preferences for faces at this age aren't limited to familiar looking people. They're actually, they extend to familiar sounding people. So work in actually Liz Belke's lab where I did my graduate work contrasted babies' preferences for people who had previously been speaking their native language versus a foreign language, and found that infants preferred to look at the face of a person who had been paired with their native language over one who had been paired with their foreign language. So one possibility is that these kinds of preferences, being drawn to people who have familiar perceptual characteristics, they're basis of the kinds of in-group biases that we see as kids grow up and become adults who have all kinds of preferences for their own in-groups. But it's not clear at all that these preferences are actually social in that way, that they're going to guide who infants want to actually interact with. They guide who they think is part of the same social group in the world, regardless of whether they are, or whether these are just perceptual preferences. Basically, ease of processing for faces that match your schema better might lead you to look longer at one face over another, without actually being about a social preference that's going to guide the way that you interact with other people. So it's hard to tease that apart with preferential looking because it's so vague in terms of what's actually drawing infants to one face or another. I think the active preference measures that I'm going to talk about a little bit later are people's best attempt to figure out, do these preferences reflect real social preferences, or are they just perceptual familiarity effects, something like science's mere exposure effect, where the things that you see in the world more often become things that you like to look at, but they don't necessarily mean anything about inferences about the social structure of the world. I just want to point out one way that people have tried to prove that these preferences are really social over perceptual, and that's to show that, at least in this language case, for what babies are preferring is the native language speaker, they wanted to ask whether you'd only prefer a person who's paired with a familiar language as opposed to any object at all that's just paired with that familiar and thus potentially perceptually appealing language. So they played English and French both with the speakers, but also in the presence of geometric objects that were not moving like agents. So I know that Laura talked a lot, showed you Hyder and Simmel movies and showed that you can interpret shapes as agents or people, but these were just shapes bouncing around the screen or rotating in random ways that were there while either the native language or foreign language was being played. And it turned out that after that kind of exposure, infants had no preference for the shape that was paired with the native language speech. It was particularly the case that when you thought a person or an agent, someone with a face that you could recognize as a potential social partner, had been paired with a familiar language, that you then had a preference to look at them over a foreign language speaker later on. So moving on to habituation paradigms, but sticking with faces for a second, you could ask, do infants are they processing those faces as individuals in the world, or are they lumping them together in any kind of way? And this would relate to the idea of, are those preferences that they're looking at going to become preferences for categories of people, in-group or out-group members later on? Do infants perceive those faces as part of social categories, or at least categories of people? And the way to look at that using a habituation paradigm is to take advantage of the fact that infant looking time often looks like this. So if you show them a habituation phase where you're getting them used to one kind of thing over and over again, you can then do a pair of test trials at the end where you look for dehabituation. Basically, you show them yet another thing that's similar to what they were watching during habituation, and you show them something that you think they might distinguish from what they saw during habituation and see if they recover attention to a greater extent. So imagine, for example, that you showed an infant a whole bunch of different versions of the letter A, and then at test, you showed them yet another new version of the letter A versus a letter B. So if they weren't extracting anything that was common about all of those different A's, then the new letter A isn't going to be any less new than the letter B, right? If there was no commonality between those elements for the baby, then both of those things at test are new to them. On the other hand, if they could extract what was common about all those letters, and they were getting sort of habituated to that common core of the category of the letter, then when they see a novel stimulus, but within the same category they've been looking at versus a totally novel stimulus category and perception-wise, then you can get a distinction in looking time to those two. So you can imagine doing the same thing with faces. You could show babies a whole bunch of novel male faces and then show them another novel male face versus a novel female face. You could do the same thing with race. You could show them a whole bunch of different faces of the same race, and then show them yet another new face from that same racial category, and then a novel racial face, and see if they're categorizing faces along those dimensions that you're showing them. And so for both of these examples, for gender and for race, it turns out that infants at the age where they're showing preferences also show this sort of categorization phenomenon. So I mentioned that infants prefer the gender of their primary caregiver. So that means most infants have a preference for female faces. But given that baseline preference also competes with this kind of preference for novelty and this habituation phenomenon, you can show an infant a whole bunch of novel female faces, and then a test presents another novel female face and a novel male face side by side, and now see that their preference for who to look at has flipped, or you can present them singularly one at a time and see how long do they look at each, and you can see if they actually now look longer at the male face than the female face. So visually, at least, they're also, in addition to being able to discriminate these faces and showing preferences for one over the other, they're also showing the ability to categorize the underlying similarities between faces of different sorts that we recognize as adults. For what it's worth, they also categorize along the dimension of attractiveness. So this is not necessarily saying that they've picked up in some way on the way that adults categorize the world. We often might apply labels or segregate by gender or by race, but maybe less so maybe not, but maybe less so by attractiveness. All right. This is not the only way that you can use habituation to try to understand categorization in infants. I'm going to demonstrate a different way that you can use habituation to do the same thing in context of a different question, which is, okay, so we've shown that infants can perceive faces, it can perceive relatively subtle differences between the way the faces look, they can categorize along those dimensions, but that's not really what social groups are about for adults all that much. Perceptual information can be telling or can help you in some cases identify who's going to be part of what group, but what social groups are to us really are groups that are defined by affiliation between individuals, right? And so who has some sort of social bond with another person. And a lot of times those bonds are evident not in the way that people look, but in the way that they interact with one another. And so we wanted to ask, I'm going to show you a brief study of my own here. We wanted to ask whether infants could use any kind of interaction cues to figure out what social categories are in the world, even when you hold perceptual features of an individual constant. And the way that we wanted to do that is rather than showing infants a whole bunch of instances of guys from one category and then seeing if they distinguish between another guy from that category and a new guy, what we wanted to do is look at the rate of habituation. So you can imagine that this is like going back and forth between A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, and AC, 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 and seeing whether or not infants see A and B to be more similar to one another than A and C, based on how quickly they habituate. So say, for example, that A and B are two different members of the same social group, whereas A and C are members of different social groups. You might then expect infants to perceive A and B as more similar to one another because they share some category membership, whereas A and C are less similar to one another because not only are they different individuals, but they don't even share a category membership with one another. And so in that case, what you're going to expect is more rapid habituation in the A-B case than in the AC case. Does that make sense? All right. So when it came to what kinds of properties of the groups we wanted to see whether or not infants would use to categorize them, we turned to the adult literature. So there's a whole literature out there called Anticipatori, which is possibly the most tongue-twisting word you can try to say correctly during a talk, and I've done it wrong many times. But what it does is it looks at what kinds of cues adults use to group people together into social categories. They sort of, what kind of gestalt principles of social groups are there out there for adults? And not surprisingly, one of the things that adults use is proximity. Who is near one another? Sometimes this is a good cue, sometimes it's a bad cue. Bus stops, for example, are probably a case where proximity is a very bad cue to who's part of the same social group. Everyone's there for an instrumental purpose rather than wanting to be near one another. But in a lot of cases, people orient themselves towards others and approach other people and cluster together in ways that give you information about their social relationships. So proximity is a perceptual cue that we thought might help. In addition to that, we know from some research on, for example, minimal groups in adults and children, that perceptual cues alone fail to delineate people into social groups a lot of the time, and that instead how those perceptual cues are used is actually important. So a study that I like is one by Rebecca Bigler. She took a classroom full of preschoolers, and she had half of them wear red shirts and half of them wear blue shirts, an extremely salient perceptual cue that split the kids in half. But she either had the teachers use this distinction to have the kids do different things, like, for example, okay, group A, red group, go eat your snack, blue group, do your work, and then vice versa, or she had them just be irrelevant to the way that the classroom was run and the way that the kids were sort of structures interact with one another. And what she found is that only the kids in the group where the shirt color was actually used to determine who was doing what when did the kids end up showing an in-group preference based on shirt color at the end of the experiment. So it's not just about really visually salient perceptual cues to who's different from who. It's actually about how those cues map onto the way that people interact together. So we use proximity and common action as a way to delineate our social groups for infants. So here's how we did that. So Laura talked a lot about how there are different cues for infants to the idea that things are agents or have minds and are capable of self-propelled behavior. In fact, they're sort of in some ways circularly defined, right? So the way that you recognize an agent is by seeing it, whether or not it propels itself, whether or not it has a face, whether or not it seems to have perceptual abilities by responding contingently to you, something like that. And that is essentially what we use to define what's an agent. So we gave these guys little faces, and they're going to control their own motion. And we either had all four of these little characters face one another together in the center of the screen and move together in a big circle, Or we put one pair over on one side and another pair over on the other side, and we had them take turns moving in separate pairs or separate groups. The idea being that we've either set up one social category based on those interaction cues, or we've set up two different social categories. After that, we ran a habituation paradigm where infants were just looking at one of the characters at a time. So they were looking at 4 different characters, and you can imagine that it's sort of either like A, B, A, B, or A, in terms of category membership, depending on which of the 2 conditions you were in, right? So obviously they all look different from one another, and there's a little bit of a 2x2 visual distinction between the characters, but how similar they are might also depend upon which of the 2 ways they were grouped together socially at the beginning of the experiment. I'm showing you guys this because it's a good example, it's the best example I have of this kind of method in a social context. The data is still in progress. Here's what it looks like so far. So over the course of the experiment, you can see that, especially toward the end, all of those red dots, which are the looking time to individuals from the one group condition, are ending up lower than all of those dots to looking time to the individuals in the 2 group condition. Yeah.
And the habituation manipulation, you just showed them those displays, or was there a whole dynamic thing, or? There's a dynamic aspect to it. So they were, they do a little, they do a little dancing together. I didn't put the demos in here, but basically they move in these curly Q patterns. They go around in a circle, and so they're going either around in a circle with everyone all together, or each pair is going around in its own separate circle, but there's proximity and common action. Yeah. Right. So then when we show them the individuals, it seems like, at least at this point, they're habituating more quickly. When we've shown them dynamic cues, the idea that these guys are part of the same social group as opposed to part of different social groups, even though the perceptual information is held constant. And so one thing I want to point out here, so part of this idea is getting back to that question of, are those preferences that infants had for gender, faces of a particular gender or faces of a particular race, are they social or are they perceptual? And part of the idea here is that we're going to be able to perceive people visually in the world, but the way that we interact with people depends upon construing them, not just as visual agents out there with certain perceptual properties, but what their social relationship to us is. And so just like you can't tell for sure whether a category is a social category for infants in the sense that it just is made up of, it's a category that's made up of people versus it's a category that means something about the affiliation between the members. You also can't tell whether a preference for a person is a perceptual preference for a familiar looking stimulus or a preference for a person who you think is going to be a better social partner for you. And one idea by being able to define groups in different ways is to say, okay, well, can we figure out whether or not a group that's defined by people who look the same way is the same kind of group for an infant as a group that's defined this way by interaction. And one way that we might be able to do that, given this kind of phenomenon, is to take advantage of the fact that habituation actually has a neural correlate. So I know you guys have been talking a lot about brain imaging methods this week, and the idea of repetition suppression might have come up. The idea that there are regions that are responsible for processing a particular kind of stimulus, and they respond less when you repeat the same stimulus than when you're altering the nature of the particular stimulus you're showing across trials. And so that effect is basically what's the neural correlate of habituation, given what a particular region cares about. If you show the participant something similar within that category, you're going to get both less looking and less neural response to successive presentations from within that category. So the idea is we could look both for regions that respond when you show, say, one female face after another, and regions that respond when you show one social group member after another defined this more dynamic and interactive way, and see whether or not there's really just some general purpose way of processing categories of agents, or whether there are different kinds of categories of people when they're defined socially based on the way that they interact with one another or the way that they're affiliated with one another, as opposed to just based on perceptual similarity between those agents. And these methods sometimes do have ways to apply the general principle to other populations, in case not all of you out there are planning on designing studies in the near future. All right, any questions about habituation paradigms before I move on to the next word thing? All right, so the next kind of developmental method is pretty similar to habituation, and it's one that I think Laura talks about a lot when I sort of mentioned that she'd gone over at the beginning of the talk, and it's what we call violation of expectation looking. And again, what you're doing is showing an infant a series of events or images, a lot like habituation. The idea is that it doesn't always have to be the case that what you see during habituation, though, is quite so analogous to what you're watching in test. So, for example, in the classic study by Amanda Woodward, she showed infants an agent reaching for an object. And the first time that agent reached for, say, the teddy bear, the babies looked for quite a long time up there on the left. And each successive time the person reached for the teddy bear, the baby looks less and less until they've habituated or she's shown them some number of familiarization trials. And then you swap the location of the objects. And so now you're not going to be showing them anything that's exactly similar to what you showed them before, right? But the question is, which of these things is going to be unexpected given what babies have seen up to this point? The person making exactly the same motion, reaching for the new object in the old location, or the person making a new motion but reaching for the same object in that new location. And the question here is, in terms of infant social perception, what are they extracting from patterns of motion that people are engaged in the world? Are they just tracking where the people move, or are they tracking, say, what the end point or the goal state of the action is when it completes? So, of course, I think you guys know this already, but what she found is that babies are surprised by exactly the same motion that goes to a new goal object. They look longer to that, especially relative to habituation, but also relative to reach to the old object now in a new place. The thing about violation of expectation, though, is it doesn't always have to be based on this kind of setup and then test kind of situation. Whoops, there we go. I animated in little reaches. There we go. Expected and unexpected. Okay. So it doesn't always have to be based on setting up some information about the world, right? So babies come in with all kinds of expectations to our experiments, otherwise they wouldn't work. And sometimes you can just test those right off the bat without showing this kind of introduction, this slow introduction of events that lead up to an expectation. So take, for example, studies of infants' perception of other people's beliefs. So I actually don't know if you guys had this when you talked about theory of mind at all, but people have looked at whether or not infants use what a person knows about the world to predict what they're going to do. And this is exactly that kind of experiment. So there's a person there, she has a visor on, but the idea is that she can see that watermelon as it slides from the green box to the yellow box in the top set of panels, but then she can't see in the bottom set of the panels because those doors are closed, that the watermelon actually slides back from the yellow box to the green box. So for adults, we would now think that she has a false belief about where that object is located. The question is, do infants similarly think that, and does that perception of her information state play any role in what they predict she's going to do next? And in this case, the researchers show this introductory scene, but that's all they do. There's no long process of familiarizing the babies to what that person is going to do next, where they're going to reach that kind of thing. She actually just then shows them one of two things. Either an expected event where the person, or for an adult, an expected event where the person then reaches into the yellow box, the last place they saw the watermelon go, or the unexpected event where the person reaches into the green box where the object actually is, but not where she should think it is given what she's seen previously. And just like in violation of expectation events where you set up this gradual regularity of pattern, you find that infants look longer at the reaching into the green box event than in the reaching into the yellow box event. Violation of expectation, that can be a measure of priors that the baby comes to the experiment with, or ones that you set up by showing them some body of evidence before you test them. So just to stick with the theme of, are social categories differentiated from just basically categories of people, of potentially social things? For instance, I'm going to show you another violation of expectation study that asks whether we treat affiliated social categories of the sort that are defined by interaction differently than just perceptual categories, either of inanimate things or even of animate things. And the way in which we wanted to know whether they would treat them differently is whether they would expect different similarities for social groups than they would expect for non-social or inanimate groups. So one thing to point out is that a common feature of affiliated groups of people is that they tend to act like one another. So for example, these people all dress alike, they all use a particular mode of transportation, maybe they don't use electricity, these guys have a different set of, they're a different affiliated social group, and they have a different set of choices about some of these things. But these people can live in really close proximity to one another. So it's not just that they've observed only one set of actions or possible ways to behave, and so that's the way that they behave. It's actually that they choose to act like their social group affiliates. Given the range of clothes you could decide to wear, or the range of places you could decide to live, or the way you could get around the world, they've chosen to do things the same way as the people that they have sort of social bonds with. So we wanted to see whether or not infants would have this same expectation about social groups. They expect social group members to act like one another. So we took 8-month-old infants, and we showed them 2 groups defined the same way that I just showed you in the other experiment. So now I've got little lines on there depicting how they move together. But there's the 3 red guys, they're facing one another, they move along those little black lines, look fairly patterned together. The yellow guys do their own kind of dance together. And after infants have been introduced to those 2 groups, what they see is that 2 of the red guys do one thing. In this particular experiment, it was hop on that purple box. In other experiments, we use other kinds of actions. And they also see that the 2 yellow guys do the other action. So they would go and jump in a similar manner, but on a blue box rather than the purple box. And then we show them what the final red and yellow characters do, and they're both going to do the same thing. So there you see the red guy jumping on the purple box. That means the yellow guy also does. And so given a violation of expectation paradigm, if infants are expecting social group members to do the same thing, they might be surprised when that final yellow guy jumps on the purple box, but less so when the final red guy does, given that that's what his group is doing all along. Does that make sense? Representative paradigm. But if we think, so there's lots of reasons why infants could expect this. They could have just gotten visually used to seeing a red thing on top of a purple box. What we wanted to ask with the study is this a particular expectation they have for social groups as opposed to other kinds of categories? And so both to ask that selectivity question, that domain specificity question, and to rule out sort of lower level accounts for such an expectation, we asked whether this kind of expectation would generalize to inanimate groups. So, Laura talked about a lot of the cues that babies use to animacy. So one of them is faces. We rearranged the faces so that they didn't look like faces anymore. And another one is sort of self-propelled non-Newtonian motion. So instead of having the guys do dancing at the beginning, we still had them move synchronously together as 2 separate groups, but they were sliding along this triangular frame together instead of dancing in a sort of self-initiated kind of way. But then we showed them exactly the same familiarization and test in terms of 2 of the red objects landing on one of the boxes and 2 of the yellow objects landing on the other, and then asking whether they'd expect the same landing locations for the final object of each kind. With one matching its category and one not matching. And finally, we also tested pretty much the same situation, keeping the cues to animacy, but removing those proximity and common action cues to social group membership. So now they see the same 6 agent-like characters that they saw in the beginning, but rather than being grouped together based on those perceptual features, and rather than dancing in groups, they're sort of intermingled with one another, and each of them dances alone in an unsynchronized fashion. And then we show infants that 2 of the yellow characters land on one box, 2 of the red characters land on the other box. We ask if they expect the same thing out of the last 2. And we did this, I was mentioning that violation of expectation studies can take a bunch of different forms. We either habituated infants to what was in that middle column right there, showed it to them over and over and over again until they were extremely bored, or we just familiarized them to show them a few times what these guys did, what these guys did, or these objects did and these objects did before moving on to test trials. So it turns out it doesn't matter what kind of setup you give them, just a little bit or a lot. When it comes to the social groups, babies expect the characters to do what their groups were doing. When they act like the other group instead, babies look longer. So this is a percentage of how much time they spent looking during the test phase in terms of what trial they were looking at. And in the inanimate case, so these are the two conditions that we contrasted with both familiarization and habituation. In the inanimate case, they no longer expected that third object to land in the same box as the first 2, and the interaction between the 2 conditions was significant. As far as the non-social group went, though, same deal. This was a familiarization study only. So again, the babies look longer in the social condition when the last guy in the group doesn't do what the first 2 did, but in the non-social condition, they don't care if that third yellow triangle hops in the same box that the first 2 did. And so the idea here is oh wait, sorry. I'm missing a slide that gives you the summary message. Basically, the summary message is, yeah, so babies are perceiving categories in the world, but it's not the case that every category supports the same kind of inferences about the world, right? So you can imagine that babies just make perceptual categories about the world. Maybe they're based on things like proximity or common action, but in the end, all it boils down to is they've grouped some objects together versus others, and those categories all serve as the basis for the same kinds of inferences. But what this suggests is the way that you create the category matters for what babies do with it, right? So, and in particular, when it comes to social categories, it seems like action, interaction, and the relationship between individuals matters more than their perceptual similarity in deciding whether or not you should make particular inferences about a kind of thing. So just because all three of those yellow triangles look the same doesn't mean they're all going to act the same way, but when they hang out together and when they dance together, all of a sudden infants now have this expectation of a phenomenon that we find in the social world amongst adults. So there's more evidence that basically you can make perceptual categories out of people in the world, and really young infants can do that, but it doesn't play the same kind of role in our model as how other people are going to act and how we should interact with them as information about the relationship between individuals does for babies. Sorry, so I should. All right. That just goes to support the idea that social cognition is not about just perceiving people in the world, it's about interacting with them and figuring out what the best way to do that is. So maybe the best way to measure social perception is to actually look at infants' attempts at interacting with other people. And I mentioned that they're relatively uncoordinated and they don't do a lot, but one thing they can do is choose things, so especially from about 6 months of age. So sometimes infants will be presented with studies like the ones I just showed you that have agents with faces, and babies will get to choose one of the agents over another because you can make them small and hand-sized as opposed to a person, which might be difficult for a baby to grab in the same kind of way. But say you do have people as your stimuli, you can also give them, say, the opportunity to choose one of two identical toys presented by two different actors. So it's not about they're choosing one of two things that look the same as one another. It's about who offered it to them as opposed to a preference for one of the particular objects over the other. And then finally, by the time infants are about a year to 18 months, they start to get more coordinated at doing additional things in the world, and they actually start to help. So one of the interesting things in the literature on ways that babies behave that's come out recently is that by about 14 months, babies spontaneously help other people. Things like if I dropped the laser pointer off the edge of the table and reached out and there was a 14-month-old down there, he might grab the laser pointer and give it back to me. This is actually, interestingly enough, is not something that they're sort of trained to do through instruction by their parents. In fact, feedback from their parents or reward for helping has the kind of reward that has the kind of effects that rewards for good grades have on kids a lot of the time, which is that they become extrinsically motivated instead of intrinsically motivated, and they actually help less. So it seems like infants are sort of motivated intrinsically to help other people, but they can also choose who to help. So this particular image comes from a study where she was trying to get that box into the cabinet. She needed someone to open the doors for her, and the question was, would babies be more likely to open the doors for her based on the way that she'd acted toward them in the past? So you can use all of these kinds of active measures as ways to look at how infants are evaluating people and how they're evaluating interactions in the world. Okay. So some examples of studies of active preference measures, and this is one that Laura might have mentioned at least in passing, and that some of you might be familiar if you were in tune with the developmental social literature at all. But a question that people have asked is, do infants prefer helpers to hinderers? So like I mentioned just a minute ago, they're intrinsically motivated to help by the time they're about a year old. But is this reflecting potentially even earlier developing preference for other people who engage in helping, and an evaluation of that as a positive behavior? So a classic version of this study is something like this. There's a classic from 2007. There's a scenario where that little red guy has been trying to climb that very steep hill and failing. He goes up almost to the top and up almost to the top and doesn't quite make it each time. And then after this introduction to his goal to get to the top of the hill, babies see two different things. They see a helper come along and push him to the top of the hill, and they see a hinderer come and push him down to the bottom of the hill. And then infants are given a choice to reach for either the helper triangle there on the left, although obviously they counterbalance across babies which one was helpful and which one was not, or the hindering square there. And what they find is that infants robustly prefer the individual who helped that circle guide to the top of the hill over the one who pushed him down to the bottom. But what was it about this pattern of events that infants found made the helper more appealing? So, for example, when you're judging someone's actions, do you just judge the actions on the basis of what that person is doing, or do the consequences of that action and the target of the action play any role in how you perceive and evaluate that action? Right? That's a question you could ask about babies' perception. Maybe they're just behaviors that they find positive and behaviors they find negative, but they can't really sort of think about them in a broader social context, or maybe the social consequences of the actions are actually what make them good or bad for babies. So a way that you can ask this question, again, trading on the fact that babies are so easy to push in terms of seeing something as an agent or not an agent, is to replace the little red circle guy climbing the hill, which is a ball with no eyes. So now when you push the ball up to the top of the hill, you're not helping an individual who has a goal to get to the top of the hill. You're engaging in exactly the same motion, but its consequences and social meaning is different. And same deal with the hinder. He pushes the ball down to the bottom. But now he's not preventing anyone from reaching their goal. And the question is, the baby does not like that downward pushing motion, right? For example, does something sound unappealing about that, or does it matter that it was being done to an agent who wanted to be doing the opposite thing? And again, the babies are given a chance to reach for one versus the other, and now the preference goes away. So now they're no more likely to reach for the guy who went up the hill than the guy who went down the hill. And so I think this reveals, yeah.
It's sort of surprising because you would think that ball with those motions, you would think of that as an agent.
Right. So so actually they skipped that part. So with the ball, it never moves up the hill. Like in addition to taking the face away, they take away the part where it tries to get up the hill. So it's mostly just a control for the actual action, the actual movement of the helper itself. And that might not be that surprising. In this case, you might have thought, okay, going up versus down a hill is not going to be intuitively appealing to a baby, regardless. But there are actions where you might think the actions themselves might be intuitively appealing or unappealing to infants. So, for example, Buon et al. Looked at sort of battery actions, bashing things versus caressing things. And they had two actors, one who bashed an object and caressed a person, and one who did the reverse. And even with those actions where you might think the actions themselves are the things the babies really care about, what they found, again, is that it matters who you were doing the actions to. So they preferred the person who bashed the object and liked the person to the one who did the reverse. So one way that infants seem to identify social interactions is not just based on the pattern of the behavior you're engaging in, but whether or not there are two agents involved in the situation at all. All right. So I mentioned at the beginning when I was talking about face preferences that it wasn't clear what kind of preferences those were. Are they just preferences that are driven by the perceptual familiarity of certain categories of faces, or are they actually going to reflect the social interactions infants are going to want to engage in with those people later on? And here were two cases where we got a preferential looking result with young infants, 4 and 5 month old infants, prefer to look at own race faces or native language speakers. And so to get at the question of whether or not these preferences are perceptual or social, people try now moving to this realm of active preference measures where babies are really interacting with people. And they did, in fact, these toy choice kind of studies that I just mentioned. So now they had a native language speaker and a foreign language speaker. Babies were introduced to each of them separately, and then they were put side by side, now silent, so they're not speaking the languages at the time, but they each held out a toy and offered it to the infant. There's this lovely magic trick that Katie Kinsler invented where the people are on the screen, they reach their arms forward, and there's these PVC pipe bars that come up and then present objects in front of the baby, like a person reached out at the screen and put the object right in front of you. Babies seemed quite convinced by this magic trick, and in fact, they were more likely to reach for the toy that was presented by the native language speaker than the foreign language speaker. But it turned out, it turned out that when subsequently looked at race preferences using the same method, there was no toy choice preference to take one of two identical toys from an actor who shared the baby's race with an actor who was of a different race. And so I want to point out that, again, this seems to go back to this central idea that what social groups are for babies is inherently linked to behavior and action and interaction. So language is a way that you interact with other people. And so there's possibly a good reason why you prefer someone who acts in a familiar way, acts in a predictable way, over this kind of perceptual preference that babies seem not to treat as a social preference unless everybody else is treating it as a social preference, and it actually influences who you're interacting with. So basically it's saying, these are like the two t-shirt colors, and sure, if babies have mostly seen blue t-shirts in their life, they might prefer to look at someone wearing a blue t-shirt over a red t-shirt in a visual preference test. But if they've never seen that dimension having behavioral consequences in the social realm for who's going to interact with who's going to coordinate their behavior together, then they're not going to care about it when it comes to social preferences about who they want to interact with. And instead, what might be more meaningful for them are these behaviors that people are going to engage in together. Yeah.
Has anybody, okay, so we're looking at newborns, and then we're jumping to 8 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
So has anybody done any longitudinal work between the newborns and the 8 months to see if this change happens suddenly, or whether or not it's a gradual shift, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for a lot of these studies, the answer is going to be no. People have just, looked at a particular age as their sort of representative of preverbal infants. And part of what a lot of the studies are trying to claim is that whether or not newborns do this, they didn't learn it through language. So for example, with the groups acting alike, it turns out that generic language has a big influence on our expectation of category similarity. When parents make generic statements, children learn that the groups in the statement are going to sort of share a common property, and this actually has a big influence in how they think about stereotyping and social categories. But if they're showing that at 8 months, that can't be how they initially learned that expectation, right? And so part of it is just ruling out that this is about language and broad social interaction. But it's really interesting to ask that question of what's the developmental trajectory going to be like for these different preferences. And so people have looked a lot at language preferences and perceptual narrowing for your ability to perceive different language, contrasts in different language. When this sort of language preference comes online, they have looked younger and younger, and they find it at roughly 5 months. And it turns out that the point at which this language preference emerges in terms of the preferential looking to one or another is about the same time when babies start to lose the ability to perceive contrast in the other language. It's about when they stop using foreign language words to categorize to create noun categories in the world. So it seems to relate with their sense that at the point at which they sense that there's a particular language that applies to them and that they should attend to, seems to correlate with the age at which they start to show social preferences based on language. So younger than that, you might expect a failure, but it might be because they're not actually telling the languages apart, not because they don't actually have the language preference yet. But some of these things you might expect to be more.
Well, okay, but yeah. I mean, people have shown that there are language preferences even prenatal, right?
Oh, right, like fox and the socks versus
right.
cat and hat.
So the other question I have, and this is probably not true, but has anybody done the language preference study on bilingual kids?
I think that they are starting to, the initial study was only from 2007. So I think the answer is yes, but that the results are sort of in progress and not published yet. But yeah. And I think the answer is that kids prefer both of the languages to which they are familiar with, but not a foreign language they're unfamiliar with. It's not like hearing multiple languages makes everything fair game. It's like they now recognize those two.
Yeah, I would be interested in knowing if there is any difference at all, because, I mean, I have 2 kids that we're bringing up bilingual, and there's an overwhelming abundance of English in the household.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there is also, I would say, about 30 to 40% of the language that they hear is Japanese. So it would just be interesting to see if that affects their social perception in any sort of a weighted sort of a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about these studies? All right. Okay. So I've covered almost all the potential ways to use these methods so far. One last one is anticipatory looking. So not only is social cognition for interacting with other people, if you're going to do it really well, you're going to predict what they're going to do next so that you can coordinate your actions with what they're going to do next. It's important to point out that violation of expectation tests don't really quite get you there in terms of knowing that infants, they're called violation of expectation tests. They can also be sort of violations of post-diction tests, right? So you can see an event and then decide afterward that it was surprising, rather than having an expectation about what's going to come next, and then having that expectation to be violated. So think about 2 alternatives for the Woodward scenario. Either infants saw those objects move and then they're like, ready for the person's next reach, and they're predicting where that reach is going to go, and they see the reach to the previously preferred object, and they think, okay, fine, that meets my expectations. Or they see the reach to the other object, and they say, oh wait, that's not what I was expecting. Or alternatively, they're just hanging out looking at the object. All of a sudden, the actor reaches for one or the other, and they consider post hoc which of those two things seems more surprising, or how well did that meet what I thought that person might do if they had reached. So the question is, can infants anticipate actions ahead of time? And here's where you really want to be able to do the eye tracking kind of thing that someone asked me about at the beginning of the study, not just measure how long do infants look at a given event, like we've been doing almost all the way through, but when they know, when there's a reason to expect that something's about to happen, where do their eyes go at that particular moment to predict where the action is going to be. So imagine now you've got those two objects, the person comes back and maybe has some reason to expect that he's going to reach right away. You can then measure where do their eyes go in anticipation of the reach. Do they go to the object the person was reaching for all along, or to the location the person was reaching for all along before the reach even happens? And that would be a better sense that there's actually an expectation about what that agent is going to do next. So I want to talk about this one again in the context of helper versus hinderer studies. Babies have that preference for helpers over hinderers themselves. But you could also ask, what do they think about the red guy? Who do they think he's going to like? Do they have any sense that beyond their own preferences, that character should like the pro-social agent over the antisocial agent? And so what you can do is put the right character right in between the two and see where babies expect that guy to move. And that's exactly what some of the research has done. So for example, the character moving, I think that's the helper over there he's moving toward, but you can show that event, or you can show the character moving toward the hinderer. This would be kind of a violation of expectation paradigm. You can measure then how long do infants look when he moves toward the helper, and how long does he look toward when he moves toward the hinderer. Are they surprised by one or the other? And in fact, by 10 to 12 months, infants are looking longer when that middle character moves towards the hinderer than when he moves towards the helper. They find it surprising for him to move toward the guy who didn't help him. And it turns out that at 12 months, you can also get anticipatory looking. So if babies know that that character is going to move one way or the other off the top of the hill, and then you put him up there and you've got the helper or hinderer on either side, you can then track where their gaze moves before the middle guy even moves. And the way that their eyes move is in anticipation of a movement toward the helper over the hinderer. So these are the kinds of anticipatory looking measures you might want. I've gone through all the methods now, but I just want to take a couple minutes, if I have them, to point out how you would, why you would want to do all these different kinds of things to look at these different kinds of scenarios, and what you're going to learn from using multiple methods with babies, which is to point out they're not doing this anticipatorily or in terms of violations of expectation until they're 10 to 12 months old. The earliest data I showed you was from 6-month-olds, where babies reach for the helper over the hinderer, and in fact they found similar results even with 3-month-olds. So the question is, why are infants themselves preferring the helper to the hinderer when they're extremely young infants, but not expecting the protagonist, who was the one who was helped or hindered, to do the same until they're much older? And is this telling us anything about the goals of the social perception that infants are engaging in, or the kind of algorithms that they're applying to understand social behavior? And points out that really these methods are most powerful in combination. You want to know not only what infants prefer themselves, or not just how they expect people to act, but how all those things fit together, and in order to best understand what kind of content infants are extracting from the stimuli that you see. So for example, showing that there's not only a looking preference, but also a social interaction preference for language groups, whereas you only see the perceptual preference for race groups, gives you a richer understanding of that kind of social preference than just one of the measures would on its own. And so I want to focus on this distinction between infants' own preferences and their expectations about other people's preferences to try to explore this a little more. And I'm going to show you one more example that's going to come in part from my own work. But first, let's point out that when it comes to individual actions, we hypothesize, at least we have in some cases, and I think Laura probably did at some point, that infants use an inverse planning model to interpret other people's actions. So this is an example from an adult study that I think you guys maybe read as part of the coursework are all familiar with. But basically, you watch this guy acting. He's choosing a food truck. He goes right past that first one, looks around the corner, and then goes back to the first one after he looks around the corner. And so the models that have been developed that explain how we then figure out what that character's preferences were, basically takes the way that you would plan your own actions given a particular array of preferences and runs that program backwards and says, okay, what array of preferences best explains the plan that that agent chose? And the idea here is that there's a potential third truck that could have been around the corner but happens not to be when the guy looks around the corner, and that's why he first goes to look, because that's his favorite truck, but then when it turns out it wasn't there, he goes back to his second favorite truck that he already walked past, right? So this is an adult example of this study, but you could say the same thing for how we think infants are arriving at their expectations in that Woodward paradigm that I've used over and over again. The person reaches for the same object over and over and over again, and the idea is that what the infants are saying is, okay, I would engage in that action if my preference were for that object, and my plan would be to reach for that one. I see this person engaging in that action, and so I'm going to use my inverse planning model to decide that's because they had a preference to reach out for that object. Similarly, there's things with characters jumping over walls, and you expect once the wall is gone that they're going to go in a straight line because you think that the goal of the jump was to avert an obstacle that was in the way of your goal state, not to engage in the jumping action itself, right? So we tend to think that infants, when they're reasoning about the individual actions of agents, are using this kind of model to figure out what the people are doing and why. So the question is, when it comes to social actions, are infants using a similar rational planner model to figure out what people are doing and why? Do we reason about social interaction in a similar way? So to try to think about this question, I'm going to tell you about some experiments that I did really, really quickly that look at preferences for imitators in young infants. So how many of you guys have ever heard of the chameleon effect? Wow. Not in a social psychology class right now. How many of you guys have ever been having a conversation with someone and noticed that you're sitting with the same posture, or you're nodding when that person nods, or you're talking louder when they talk louder, or any of those kinds of things? So you're sort of mirroring their behavior subtly, right? So this is the chameleon effect. You're changing yourself to mirror the other person. And it turns out you do this more when you like the person you're talking to. When the person you're talking to does this to you, you like them more. There are all of these kinds of positive social causes and consequences of this kind of imitation of other people. And so we wanted to see, sort of with infants, does this imitation preference apply to really young infants who actually don't do a lot of imitating yet? They get imitated very frequently by their own parents and other adults. If you ever want to watch something funny, just watch an adult interact with the baby for a little while, and as soon as the baby does something interesting, the adult will undoubtedly repeat it back to the baby. And so what we wanted to ask is, do infants reason about these kinds of interactions? Will they prefer an imitator to a non-imitator themselves? And like you might, if you were watching people interact and mirror one another versus interact and not mirror one another, will they make inferences about relationships between people based on who chooses to mirror? So the first thing we found is that if you show infants something like this, where there's a purple guy who's repeating the same action over and over again, and a blue guy who imitates that action of his, and a red guy who doesn't, if you just give babies a choice between the imitator and the non-imitator in either a preferential looking or a preferential reaching test, young infants prefer the imitator. But it turns out that really young infants, 4-month-olds, just like the 4-month-olds in the helping studies, though they have this preference themselves for imitators, they don't have any expectation that the target is going to approach the imitator over the non-imitator. They're not reasoning about, even though the behavior was directed toward him, just like the helping and hindering behaviors were directed toward that protagonist, they're not actually reasoning about who that guy likes. So one possibility is that this reflects the fact that imitation and maybe social perception in general at this age is serving to identify good partners for the baby rather than serving for them to make more inferences about how people are going to act in the world, right? So I think Ken has talked a little bit about what are the goals of social perception, what is it adapted and used for, and possibly one reason why you're not seeing reliable predictions about other people's actions based on social interaction is that what infants are trying to do is figure out who they should want to go interact with, and they're not at that point not really concerned about what's going to happen next in someone else's social interaction. Yeah.
Older kids use these cues to reason about other people? Because, I mean, when you asked the group, the idea was familiar to some, but not everybody realizes this explicitly.
Oh, the imitation? Yeah. So yes. So 4-year-olds. 4-year-olds think that the target is going to no. Actually, I don't know. 4-year-olds think that the imitator likes the target more than the non-imitator does, but they don't necessarily, and I'm going to actually show you some evidence that infants do the same thing in just a second, but I don't think anyone has actually asked the reverse question about whether the target likes one more than the other or not. There's a little bit, actually, and this is a relatively understudied aspect of adult social cognition. There are 2 studies on what we think about people who are imitating other people based on characteristics of the target themselves. So, for example, if there's someone who's imitating someone who's then being quite rude or mean to them versus someone who's imitating someone who's being quite nice to them, you find the imitator to be more competent in the case where the person was nice to them than when the person was mean to them. And you can find myriad cases where these effects hold. Like, for example, waitresses who repeat a customer's order verbatim back to them get higher tips than waitresses who paraphrase orders. So, and in fact, the helping study I showed you there with the 18-month-olds where the person was trying to get something in the cabinet, the manipulation there is imitation. So has the experimenter imitated the baby, the 18-month-old or not? And 18-month-olds are more likely to help people who've imitated them. So it's true that the interactions hold quite readily. I don't know how good older kids are at precisely that inference. I would expect they can do it, but I don't know for sure. Yeah.
Are people who imitate more likely to demonstrate pro-social behavior?
Are people who imitate more likely to demonstrate?
Is it valid too?
So the question would be sort of, are they more likely to demonstrate pro-social behavior toward that particular target? Right, like these actually. So, and Nancy, to your question about whether or not they know that the target is not like the imitator back. So that kind of imitative behavior is driven by the situation you're in to some extent and how much you like the person. So how much you imitate a person is reliably predicted by how much you say you like them. I don't know about other pro-social actions toward them, but if you say you like an experimenter a lot, then you're more likely to imitate them. Also, if you've been ostracized or rejected recently, if you're in the need of social affiliation, you imitate more, and that's true for both 5-year-olds and for adults. So it seems like it's a behavior that you have at least an implicit expectation will lead to social affiliation for you.
Almost an ingratiation, sort of.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. You do it when you want someone to like you, whether it's because you like them or because you need friends at that particular moment. Right. Right, so this is one possibility, but, and this is sort of what I just mentioned to Nancy, that idea would predict they're not going to make any inferences about anyone in that situation. They just decide who their own preference is based on what they saw, and they're not reasoning about the rest of the agents and what's going to happen next for any of them. But it turns out that if you reverse the situation, and now you have 2 different targets, and you have a guy who imitates one of them and not the other, really young infants do in fact expect that guy who imitated to approach the person he imitated rather than the one he didn't. So this has never been done in a helping context. It would be like, for example, having someone who helped one individual and hindered another, then asking is he more likely to approach the guy he helped than the one he hindered. So are you making any inferences about the agent's social preferences based on who he acted nicely toward and who he didn't act nicely toward? And it turns out that before they're making the inferences about the targets, they are in fact making these inferences about the actors. And this is where I particularly wonder about the rational planning model, right? Because the way that you'd figure out a person's preference for one object over another is to think about the effect that their action had on the world, and then go back from that and figure out, okay, why was that plan, what kind of preference does that plan reflect given the consequences that it had? You know, reaching for the laser pointer versus the bottle of water is something where you can figure out that I wanted the bottle of water because the effect with that, I obtained the bottle of water, right? But it's essentially saying here that infants aren't really understanding the psychological effects that acting nicely towards someone is having on them, right? They don't get that when you're nice to someone, they're going to like you back. So how are they using the fact that you were nice to someone to figure out that you prefer that person to someone else? Right? It sort of seems like you're missing the understanding of the effects of the action that you would need to have made that action your plan in the first place. And the interesting thing is that infants this age don't actually imitate themselves. It's not until they get to about 10 months, which is where they start to do things like predict that the target will, or that the protagonist will approach helpers over hinderers. That's the age at which they really start to engage in a lot of pro-social activities themselves, imitating other people, helping other people. And so it does seem like their own planning of actions depends upon understanding the outcome of that action in terms of the recipient of your actions then feeling back toward you. But at the same time, they're managing to figure out what actors of pro-social actions they like before they're understanding those causal effects on the psychological states of other people. So it's possible that we need a different kind of model that isn't an inverse planning model to understand the earliest of how infants interpret social actions toward other people. The focus is on the idea that you do nice actions toward people that you like without necessarily including the piece that says you do that because you want them to like you back and because you're planning the right way to get them to like you back, which is to do something nice toward them. So that's my general introduction to how we use different kinds of behavioral methods to think about social interaction in infancy. And hopefully I've convinced you that they're actually going to help us figure out what the building blocks are of the way that we answer all of these questions. Thanks. Questions? Yeah?
So has anybody combined this behavioral method with some sort of measure of brain activity, say evoked potential? Like at some point you said something about
repetition suppression.
Inferences not being driven by just stimuli. And you can imagine that, for example, those potentials are really well characterized, right? So you can maybe have differential patterns according to what sort of, what type of looking behavior you're having in your response to something.
So the idea is that you might, that the different types of looking time measures might track with different sorts of neural phenomena.
Yeah, so I think in the extreme case in humans, you would imagine doing this with an MRI, right? But infants, kids, it's hard to do that. But you can imagine also doing that with an EEG cap, perhaps. Yeah. And maybe the pattern effectively is going to be different depending on whether this is whatever you label this looking phenomenon. Habituation
versus preference versus anticipatory looking, yeah. So I don't know how much you'd expect different patterns based on what kind of method you were using. So for example, I wonder if a surprising action that's surprising by default, if the way that you would distinguish that neurally would be different than say than dishabituation, recognizing a novel stimulus in a category. It's certainly true that you should be able to use neural methods with infants to tease apart some of these different hypotheses, though, right? So like I was talking about with different kinds of social categories, you might expect different regions to be tracking, say, oh yeah, that's another person that belongs in the perceptual category that all those other people did, versus that's another character that belongs in the same social category as other people did. And you certainly should be able to use similar methods to the ones we've used here to ask those questions in terms of neural responses rather than in terms of behavioral looking time responses. The question, right, is what kind of method do you use to do it? And so you mentioned fMRI. People are trying to do fMRI with infants. They do a lot of sleeping studies with babies listening to language, because it turns out the auditory cortex will still respond to properties of language while you're asleep. And they're even trying to do awake studies. I mean, Nancy and Rebecca are involved in a project trying to look at sort of early distinctions and where different types of stimuli are processed in the brain. But there's also another method that might hopefully potentially help work a little bit better with infants, because they can sit on their parents' laps in an upright fashion. They don't have to be laying down motionless in a scanner. And it's called near-infrared spectroscopy. And it uses infrared light to measure changes in blood flow rather than magnet, the fMRI magnet. And so that's actually something that we have as part of the CBMM project as well. So we recently obtained a near system, and we're trying to use it to study infant social perception at the moment. So hopefully we will be able to take things like the habituation measures and make repetition suppression analogies of them that we can do imaging studies with infants, for sure.
And just to add to that a little bit, also, I didn't exactly do the question, but you can also approach this kind of stuff with adult functional MRI. So I cut this lecture because there were too many lectures, but lots of people, including in my lab, are trying to understand a whole piece of the brain that's along the superior temporal sulcus that kind of runs from here all the way down the temporal lobe down to there. It's about 12 centimeters long, and all on either side of that region of the brain, it's just a rich microcosm of high-level social perceptual stuff. It's really fascinating. Probably a lot of the stuff that Lindsey talked about and that Ken talked about is computed in there. And so one of the things we're trying to do is understand high-level social perception by figuring out what its components are, if it has any, by kind of mapping out the functional associations in that part of the brain. And as just one example, not my work, but work from Kevin Pelfrey's lab, he's used pretty much exactly the Amanda Woodward paradigm that Lindsey talked about. So you have the person who reaches many times for object A over here, and then you switch the position of A and B. Now do you expect them to go for the same object over here or the same action over here? And then Woodward shows that infants understand, whatever age, 10 months, I can't remember.
5. Yeah.
Expect the person to reach for the same object, not to just rotely do the same action. Well, you can do that with functional MRI. You just show videos of that. And what Kevin Pelfrey finds is that a big chunk of the superior temporal focus responds more to the unexpected action than the expected action. So there's lots of work of that kind, trying to map out in the brain some of this high-level social perceptual stuff that Lindsey and Ken talked about.
Yeah.
So one of the assumptions of a lot of this work, and Josh talked about it quite a bit, is the idea that there's sort of this process of hypotheses that are developed over time. Mm-hmm. Has anybody taken a look at when infants learn to do certain types of things, and then kind of look maybe correspondingly at macaques and looked at their particular physical maturation properties, so kind of similar to what they do in like B1 in mice with respect to, you know, the development of early vision and critical periods in those areas, that shows that there's a physical correlate, or is it purely sort of a learning process where they actually are specifically connecting categories as opposed to corresponding to maturation particular parts of the brain?
Well, I think it's much harder to study the physical maturation of the brain in a living infant than...
That's why I said macaque. So you imagine you could do a lot of these kinds of things with looking with a young macaque and actually...
Maybe. It's been mildly successful and mildly unsuccessful. Preferential looking is okay. Violation of expectation looking, people have tried to do a little bit of, but not as successfully yet.
I just had one example. There's a study that was published a few years ago by a guy named Sugita, who was asking about the role of experience in development of the face perception system in macaques. The reason to do this in macaques is you can control their experience in a way that's unethical in humans. Maybe it's unethical in macaques, but it's fine. In any case, he raised baby monkeys for 6, 12, or 24 months without ever letting them see a face. Never a single face in their whole life. They were born in the dark, they were raised in the dark, they were cared for by human caregivers who had roofs over their heads. So this is a really precious opportunity, and they didn't have horrible lives. They got lots of nurturing and cuddling, but just by humans with hoods over their heads, right? And they had rich visual environments, just no faces. So that enables you to ask, at least in that case, whether experience with faces is necessary for the development of face perceptual abilities. He then used the methods that Lindsey talked about, dishabituation. So you habituate to face A and you switch to face B in order to ask, can the monkey discriminate those two faces? They did that test on the very first day the monkeys ever got to see a face at any point in their life, and the monkeys were indistinguishable from normal monkeys, which is a result so powerful and astonishing that I can hardly believe it. I mean, I love nativist stories, but this is so extreme. This says that it's not just that you can get very good face discrimination abilities, and the stimuli were very similar. There were no hair cues, it was just internal face features, very subtly different faces. And those monkeys who had never seen faces at any point in their life were as good as normal adult monkeys who are damn good at this. So, you know, that's just one data point. I'd love to see this replicated because it's so astonishing. I would have thought that some of the face system is innate, but you'd still use experience to tune it up, for God's sake. This experiment says no, a sufficient fully adult system with zero experience. So
were the monkeys were they adolescents, or what age did they?
6, 12, or 24 months. 24 months is, what's that, a juvenile? Did anybody go to March Livingston's talk? I forget how this goes.
Maybe like 8 years old.
8 years old. Like 8 years old, right. Wow. So still young.
Yeah. I'd say partly the ability to do that kind of study depends on whether or not particular measure that you're using is a good measure for reliably getting individual differences, right? So part of the problem with a lot of these studies is that they work in the aggregate with whole groups of infants, but looking at any one individual infant's behavior in a violation of expectation study with just 2 trials is going to be hard to interpret to any one given macaque, you know. But preferential looking is actually a particularly good and dishabituation is a particularly good kind of measure, because if you give it an infant or a macaque 2 different choices to look at, and then you're measuring them over a period of time, every fraction of a second is a chance for them to make another choice. There's actually a lot of data that you get in preferential looking between 2 options of. And so I think that's, so some of these things like violation of expectations for reaching are things that you might not really see in every baby on every pair of trials. In the preferential looking test, I think you could get better measures like we track an individual's experience or with physical changes to the brain.
I mentioned that these deprivation experiments are really very interesting and in that case, quote, conclusive, if you can believe them, but they're only one-sided in the sense that if you deprive something of something, you could always make the argument that the system was deprived and it actually needed stimulation for its normal development. In the sense that, in other words, if you have a neural system that's already there, but it's not being stimulated over many months, that could just wither away.
But when it survives, when it's resilient to the deprivation, it gets stronger.
Right, but it's a one-sided kind of experiment. There's no, that's fine, they got the result, but in a sense, it's not a completely powerful experiment. I mean, it's very...
They got lucky.
They got lucky. And then the other thing you mentioned that the thing that's interesting about it, then they showed them different kinds of faces later on, and those monkeys actually couldn't do it after a period of training. One kind of face, another do it. Either a monkey face or a human face.
Yeah, so what they did is, I left this out, there was an effective experience, right? So at the initial testing, they were adult-like and equally good at human faces and monkey faces. They then took those monkeys and put them for a month in an environment where they only saw human faces or only saw monkey faces. And at the end of that period, the effect of the experience was not to improve performance, discrimination ability at all. It was to throw out ability to discriminate the unexperienced species. So there was this poignant situation where some of those monkeys were put in an environment with human faces for that month, say at age 2 years. After that month, they could then discriminate human faces, not monkey faces, and then for years later, in an environment with only monkey faces, or monkey and human faces, they never regained the ability to discriminate monkey faces. So there is an effective experience, but it's this perceptual narrowing effect of eliminating abilities, not constructing. Amazing.
Yeah, so I wonder if in that experiment, when they first exposed the monkeys to mutations, they also do the control experiment in which they expose them to, say, another object, which they also had not seen.
Wouldn't that be great? They didn't do that, or they haven't reported that yet, but yes, indeed, that would be great. Sorry?
Which actually goes along with the concern that Ken expressed.
Or the other experiment of paint various patterns on those hoods of the caregivers. You know, there's just a whole rich array of things to be done there. What was the name of the author? Sudhita, a 2008 PNAS. Incredible paper.
So one of the things I was thinking about, it's a quick question. So when you mentioned about the false belief path in infants, it seems like infants are so smart, they understand the perspective of other people and they engage in social behavior. But then, like in age 3, for example, they fail the typical, like the other theory of mind path, and then they seem to regain it in like age 5 or something. So what happened in between, or is it just a task demand that, for example, one is more visual, the other is more verbal, or it's like depending on visual working memory or something like that?
So that's not a short question. That's a big controversy that people spend a lot of time talking and thinking about. The answer is part of an answer is it's definitely task demand. So you can do implicit theory of mind measures with, say, 2-year-olds or young 3-year-olds who will fail the verbal questions. But if you do things that, not living time, but other kinds of implicit measures, like, for example, say that there are several boxes that are containing an object, and an experimenter put one in one and then leaves, and someone else moves it to a different box. Then that experimenter comes back. You could ask, so to the 3-year-olds, very helpful, you could ask, do they point to the box the experimenter circled in? Do they engage in pointing finger to help them find the object? And 3-year-olds who fail verbal false belief tasks will be more likely to point when the experimenter has a false belief about where the object is than when they watch the transfer and they have a true belief about where the object is. Does that make sense? So you have an experimenter who's coming back into the room, either with knowledge of the object and the date that somewhere has been moved and knowledge of where it's been moved to, or with ignorance about where it's been moved to, or that it's been moved at all. And 3-year-olds who fail a verbal false belief test are more likely to point for the ignorant experimenter than for the knowledgeable experimenter. So it's definitely not like 3-year-olds have lost somehow their understanding of false beliefs they used to have, and they regain it when they're 4. It's definitely that different tasks seem to locate that ability and other tasks don't. And the question is why? Is it entirely about executive function that frequently demand different tasks, or are there some other kinds of